There are two types of turn-based combat systems I deeply enjoy in RPGs, and I believe those two systems can be great learning tools for developers. The first is the fast-paced combat system found in games like Valkyrie Profile, Legend of Legaia, and Helen's Mysterious Castle. The second is the slower and more deliberate combat found in games like Darkest Dungeon, Ring of Pain, or Fear and Hunger. Now, when I describe these systems as fast or slow, I do not mean actual time measurement. A battle in Darkest Dungeon can end within seconds, while encounters in Valkyrie Profile can sometimes drag on for a long time. So what I'm talking about is emotional pacing, how the combat feels, the intention behind the design. For this video, I want to use these games as two ends of a spectrum. Not to declare a winner, because neither system is inherently better than the other. I instead want to compare these approaches and define what makes them work, so that developers, especially newer ones, can more easily understand what kind of combat system fits their own projects. Because while both systems come with unique challenges, one of them is significantly easier to create for smaller teams and beginner developers, using tools like RPG Maker. And I think understanding those differences is incredibly important for RPG developers, because a lot of turn-based combat systems fail for the exact same reason. And hopefully we can find that reason in today's episode. Hi, I'm Lorden, and welcome to Mind Behind Media. In my opinion, the best combat systems reflect the tone of the world they exist in, and they support the psychological state the game wants the player to be in. If the world is cruel and hostile, like in Darkest Dungeon or Fear and Hunger, then the combat system can reinforce that cruelty by being oppressive and unforgiving. The game may not care how much time the player has invested into a run. If you fail, you fail. If you die, you die. And that might be the end of the run, if you're lucky. That emotional brutality is the point and becomes part of the experience itself. However, there's also a worst-case scenario. A combat system can become slow without becoming meaningful. Encounters happen too frequently. Enemy mobs become too repetitive. The player stops making interesting decisions. And eventually, combat turns into a chore rather than a tense but enjoyable experience. The opposite problem exists as well. A combat system can become fast and punishing without creating satisfaction. Failure stops being a learning opportunity and instead becomes frustrating. And worst of all, combat can begin to feel meaningless. The encounter happens, but nothing changes afterwards. No important resources were spent, no meaningful progress was made. The battle existed only to fill time. If encounters happen often, then combat should at least remain engaging or resolve quickly enough not to be exhausting. A slower, more deliberate combat system usually revolves around danger. It forces the player to slow down and weigh every choice they make, because every wrong decision could end the run or mean a game over. Resources are scarce and enemies are deadly. Long-term planning becomes essential. The player is expected to approach encounters carefully and think several steps ahead. That way, every bit of exploration and every encounter becomes meaningful, because every decision matters and every mistake carries consequences. The player is not simply trying to win the current fight, they are trying to survive the entire journey. Fast-paced combat systems focus on something entirely different. Their primary goal is flow, the sensation of speed, rhythm, and momentum. The punishment for failure is therefore not always a game over. Instead, failure interrupts the player's flow state. In Valkyrie Profile, you decide when your party members attack within your turn, and some weapons let you attack multiple times in a row. This leads to combos. If played right, your combos can juggle the enemy like in a fighting game, and because of that, these systems often feel more playful and expressive. But that doesn't mean that slower, more punishing games cannot create flow as well. Ring of Pain is a very good example for this. Despite having a ruthless and difficult combat system, Ring of Pain can still place the player into a flow state. However, it achieves this in a very different way than games like Valkyrie Profile. The flow does not come from animations, combos, or rapid inputs. It instead comes from structure and pacing. The player moves directly from one encounter into the next, with only brief moments of reprieve in between. There's very little exploration or downtime. Because of that, the game maintains momentum even while having tactical turn-based combat. If Ring of Pain featured exploration, environmental traps and treasure chests, in the vein of Darkest Dungeon or Fear and Hunger, it would likely push players towards a far more cautious and deliberate playstyle. The constant possibility of hidden danger would transform every decision into calculated risk. And I think this is important to understand. Fast combat and slow combat are not absolute definitions. A slower combat system can still create momentum, and a fast combat system can still feel repetitive or exhausting if the pacing is handled poorly. So how should developers approach these two styles of combat? Personally, I would argue that fast-paced systems are much more difficult to implement successfully. There is a much heavier technical burden. A lot of animations have to be created for the combos to look and feel right. So there has to be a great artist on the team. The inputs need to feel responsive, and the attacks require proper timing. Then there's the challenge of hitboxes and hurtboxes, meaning the areas where characters or enemies can be hit. And these mechanics need to interact smoothly enough to maintain flow. This becomes more difficult in 3D games like Legend of Legaia. In many ways, these systems resemble fighting games. And balancing fighting games is notoriously difficult. My advice for new developers therefore would be to start with the slow-paced, dangerous and tactical combat system. Take Fear and Hunger for example. On paper, its combat system is incredibly simple. Enemies are mostly static images. You select individual body parts to attack. Those parts flash briefly when hit, and that's about it. There's no huge attack animations, no flashy visual effects, and very little spectacle overall. And yet, the combat still feels tense, strategic, dangerous, and very impactful. Which is interesting because Fear and Hunger was made in RPG Maker, a toolset that's often seen as fairly limited. But despite those limitations, the game still managed to build a combat system that players genuinely remember. And that highlights something important. Good combat design isn't always about visual complexity. Sometimes it's about giving the player meaningful decisions and mechanics that naturally create tension. And I think that's an important lesson for developers, because despite being made with the RPG Maker and not having flashy animations or having a huge budget behind it, Fear and Hunger is a very beloved indie game because of its mechanics. The themes of the game are a completely different story, although people love those as well, I guess. So here's a guideline if you want to develop a game with a slow-paced, difficult combat system. Learn how to create tension, learn how to create meaningful decisions within combat, and learn how to make encounters matter. Then over time, when you gain more experience as a developer, you can experiment with speed and flow. You then use smaller sprites, simpler animations, limited input systems. Games like Helen's Mysterious Castle are excellent examples of how smaller projects can still experiment with fast-paced combat ideas without requiring massive production value. Because ultimately, good combat design is not about complexity, it's about intention. The players should feel what the combat wants them to feel, and the mechanics should support that feeling consistently throughout the game. That's it for today. I wish you the best of luck with your future projects, and I hope each game you make teaches you something new. Now go out and create something beautiful. And remember, saying RPG game is like saying ATM machine. Thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day.